One of the major problems for blockchains is the inability to communicate and transfer information across different blockchain networks. This also put a strain on scalability and mainstream adoption. Our guest today is a co-founder of one of the few projects in the space tackling this problem and creating the fabric to allow building of bridges across chains. In the following talk, we will discuss why is blockchain interconnectivity important, as well as what is the Aeon approach towards achieving it. Without further ado, please welcome Kesem Frank.
So hello, Kesem. Thank you very much for being here and welcome to the Online Crypto Summit.
My pleasure. Hi, Vicky. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. So would you share a bit about your background and what excited you about blockchain technology in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thanks for having us. My name is Kesem Frank. I'm one of the co-founders and the COO of a company called Nuco. We started around 2 years ago is a continuation of a project that was originally kicked off in Deloitte. Me, Matt, Jen, the three co-founders, my partners, we're all ex-Deloitters, different backgrounds, but we all did go through, the Deloitte check mark, I guess. About 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago now, actually, my partner Matt had a very simple but powerful pitch to the then Deloitte CEO here in Canada, and the pitch was very simple. What does Deloitte's business look like in a world driven by cryptocurrencies? So assume that everything and anything, payments and banks and over-the-counter stuff, it's all based on crypto. What does that mean for a business model such as Deloitte's? You could look at the books for companies such as Deloitte, EY, KPMG. Nearly 60% of revenues, they're driven by the audit practice, right? Very old school, very old period way of doing business, assuming the inefficiencies between movement of funds, payments, transactions, and so on. The short answer is, in a world that is purely driven by cryptocurrencies, that business is going away. It doesn't make sense to audit books and try to match transactions when you literally have a single source of truth, when you have a blockchain that underpins everything. And that quick pitch was enough to really, get the senior folks back in Deloitte into taking it seriously. And when I say taking it seriously, it meant that they funded us the very first budget to do this, full time, not side of desk. What excites me about blockchain is literally that, the future that it facilitates. There are so many different processes today that we kind of take for granted. There are so many inefficiencies, friction points that we just assume have always been there and need to be there forever. That is not the case. Blockchain really addresses that at a very profound level. I think that what I like about this domain, what keeps me going in this domain, is this notion that this is not a marginal improvement. This is not trying to solve a business problem where the outcome improves the return or an efficiency maybe by 5 to 10%. That's not the case. This is literally transformational. This changes the foundation of how we do things. And it's fantastic. It still blows my mind that we have this opportunity to really engage with a space where we're at the ground floor, creating an industry, fabricating it maybe from nothing.
Sounds fascinating. So can you talk a bit about Nuco's core project Aeon? What do you aim with it? Where are you guys heading with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so a bit, apologies, but a little bit of a history lesson, in the crypto world. Things that we did, 5 and 4 years ago, they're already kind of ancient history, but I don't want to assume that everyone's on the same page.
Yes, please. That would be nice to fill the audience in.
Sure. So we ran, we were at Deloitte running this practice, the blockchain practice. As far as I know, it was the first, fully dedicated project team for blockchain by any of the global SIs, by any of the global system integrators. This ran for a couple of years, and we learned a lot by going over the premise of how do you take this new novel technology, blockchain, and how do you socialize it and apply it in the context of very mature businesses? Meaning, how does it affect the banks, government, healthcare, insurance, and all of these gigantic industries that are very much global in scope? Fast forward 2 years, so this would be 2 years ago, we kind of had this moment of truth, right? We were convinced that this is going to transform the world. And if this was going to transform the world, the honest question we had to ask ourselves was, what are we going to do about it? Are we happy to stay, and by the way, I had a fantastic time in Deloitte. They're still very much connected with us. They're our clients, so I'm very loyal. But was I going to be happy living my life knowing that there's a revolution going on and only trying to monetize or be involved, actually, regardless of monetization, at the peripheral? Was I happy only to sell consulting, advisory, implementation, or did I want to do the thing itself? And obviously we're having this conversation, so you know the answer to that question. We ran the company for the first year and a bit even on the same premise, meaning we understood that we needed to come up with a very proficient stack, an architecture, if you will, that will be meaningful for the problem statement of really helping these enterprises integrate blockchain. It's a very complex process when you're trying to take things that, reality in enterprise is only measured in production. Is something production ready and will actually make it to the operational platform? Or is it, a sandbox or a POC or whatever? We saw all this technology coming from what blockchains could do, but it was pretty early in the game. This is before IBM and Hyperledger. This is before a lot of other things that happen on the market. So you have this super high potential, but you have this really low level of maturity. How do you bridge it, right? How do you close that gap? What was pretty much the mission statement for the first year of operations here at Nuco. What happened later is an inspiration. If you gather all of these learnings, if you have all this insight about how do you actually take blockchain technology and productionize it, right? How do you actually improve the scalability? How do you improve the performance, security, stability, even all these things that really matter in the real world? What are you going to do about it? Do we continue, going to business by going client after client, whatever, organization after organization, consortium after consortium? Or did we actually want to take a global strategy? Did we actually want to create a fabric that is free for all, right? So it's a permissionless blockchain that incorporates all of the learnings that we've had. And that was pretty much the inception of Aon. It was about bringing the value, as we already created and demonstrated in the enterprise setting, to everyone that wants to use it. It is very much akin to the reason that Tesla, with the mission statement of transforming how we do transportation, open sources its designs and no patents. Don't sit on top of your learnings and try to profit out of essentially charging people for access to the knowledge. Do the other way around. Put the knowledge out there, give it to the world, contribute it, and I'm pretty sure that you and hopefully our audience is aware we have contributed the entire code base of Aon now publicly, and we are very much committed to making it into an open source and open standard. that was kind of the idea behind doing Aeon. To make blockchain into a global movement, you need to think globally, and to think globally means to think openly.
Very nice. So also Aeon is, you said it's a fabric that connects different blockchains and infrastructures and kind of unites them together. Do I'm getting this right?
Yeah, so it is right, but I would say it's only a single facet out of what it does. So maybe it's worth stating, what it is we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
We are, genuine believers, sincere believers in the value that blockchains have for pretty much anything where today we have to rely on intermediaries. So we see a world where blockchains drive a much more significant portion of the services, the functionalities that we kind of all expect out of the modern world. And if that's the goal, how do you get there? You get there by creating a movement. You create momentum that will drive mainstream adoption of blockchain. To do that, you essentially need to socialize it with some very, old school conservative organizations. The first time that we understood that there was a problem with the blockchain approach before we came up with Aeon was literally just a client conversation. We've done a pretty interesting project last year with a group called TMX. TMX stands for the Toronto Montreal Exchange. It's public. You could Google it, and the project scope was around settlement of commodities. It was actually natural gas. What they asked us was the following two questions. This is after we delivered a project and it was a big success and everyone was happy, and we started talking about, okay, what's next? They asked us, okay, you've proven that you could bring an order of magnitude of efficiency to how we do settlement. Could you now take the same platform, the same blockchain that you've developed, and apply it for different kinds of commodities? So if the original project was natural gas, they asked us about crude oil, they asked us about agriculture, they asked us about liquefied gas, they asked us about a bunch of asset classes. And the answer was yes, across the board, no problem. Like, as long as you have the same business logic, doesn't really matter what it is you're actually tokenizing on top of the blockchain. The second question, however, was more complicated. They asked, well, can the fact that party A and party B settle a commodity on the blockchain, could that trigger a payment event or an insurance event coming from different blockchains? Mm-hmm. And that was a much more complex challenge to crunch through. It is not the easiest thing. It is not the most feasible thing to do to move cross chains today. I'm even thinking of the big public chains, regardless of problem statements in enterprise. I buy Bitcoin because I truly believe in decentralization. I truly believe that I want my value stored on top of a network that is permissionless and open and free for all, right? But then I also like Ether a lot. I want to take my Bitcoin and I want to buy Ether with it. And the way that this works today is, it blows my mind on how big of a friction we have. We have to go from this purely digital asset, a Bitcoin, from on-chain, we go off-chain, we go through an exchange, over the counter, whatever it is, and then on-chain again. So for me to really enjoy the benefits of what blockchain actually means, I am forced to go off-chain. This makes zero sense. This makes zero sense. It didn't make sense for the enterprises. It does not make sense for the public, permissionless blockchains. Aeon was born out of the insight that if you think about it, the only acceptable literally the only acceptable go-between any two blockchains has to be a blockchain itself. That is the only way that we could keep decentralization across, not just when we are on-chain, but still having, you know, these exit, you know, on and off ramps off-chain. We are literally trying to create a world where that is no longer the case, where we really solve for that problem. So going back to your original question, yes, bridging between different blockchains that are permissioned, right? They're enterprise blockchains that they are spun out to do something. There is a use case or maybe several use cases that really drive the usage of those chains. That is one functionality. That is only one benefit that the AN is meant to do. But it's meant to be much larger. It is meant to also cross between, or bridge maybe, between the permissioned and the permissionless world, so private and public, if you will. It's also meant to bridge the purely public blockchains, so to solve the problem statement that I've described. And that's a huge scope. That is pretty much the vision that we have.
Wow, it sounds really big. So this is actually what you mean by being the world's first public dedicated enterprise blockchain.
And I would, to be honest, sure, my personal background is in enterprise, and of course we ran the company for almost a year on the sole premise of enterprise, but I would actually drop the enterprise from the mission statement. Enterprise will be a really important benchmark, but it's really about connecting the blockchains of the world, regardless of the use case that drives them.
So what is the current state of the AON development? How do you have any blockchains connected already?
So the current state is, and this excites me because, again, you know, for me personally, coming from an enterprise background, success is you know, I sit in a boardroom and there's a bunch of bankers around the table, and you show them what you just built for them, and you know, poker faces, and yeah, and if you see like this really slight nod, then that's a success. You're excited, right? This is like opposite of how it is to work with the community, and that's why this is such an amazing and rewarding experience. We've contributed the full code base earlier this year. We are now at the state where development is sure. There is still obviously a core team that runs organically, but we're now at the state where the community engagement side of things is really picking up. And that is so gratifying. Like, I can't even describe how amazing it is to see all these people you've never met, you've never talked to even, that are excited about the project. They're contributing to the project. They're helping to advance the code base. They help us debug. They help us think of new features. So we've open sourced earlier this year. It was a big moment. It was over 200,000 lines of code that got contributed. It is now been running in testnet for over a month now, almost 2 months actually. And we're pretty excited with the benchmarks. So again, you know, when you were thinking about technical platforms such as blockchains, you really need to look at the KPIs. You really need to look at those key performance indicators that show you how good you are at what you say you could do. And we've been pretty happy with how progress has been made on our testnet. The next big milestone would be the launch of the mainnet. That is coming up literally in the next, I think it's in the next 30, maybe 60 days that we've committed to making the mainnet live. After that, after you actually have the blockchain up and running, then it is all about the bridges. The first bridge that we are designing and already testing, to be honest, is the Ethereum to AON bridge. So today there's the AON token, ERC-based token, a pretty commonplace in the blockchain world. What we are trying to do that, again, to my knowledge, hasn't been done before, is to actually become the test users of our own architecture in terms of bridges, meaning we want to allow the community, people holding the token today, to actually go through a bridge to emerge on the other side, going from the Ethereum blockchain to the AIM blockchain, going in with the AIM token, emerging on the other side with an AIM coin. And
So
that would be, obviously, that's kind of a critical functionality for our own stack. And it's a very powerful, we hope, demonstration of how the technology works.
Can you explain a bit how those bridges work? What do you mean by having a bridge from Aeon to Ethereum?
So, you know, when you think about it, when you think about why does it make sense to bridge it all, I will give you 3 reasons of why bridging is you know, I would argue a good idea. Let's start with what we've already covered. We talked about the use case that is completely public blockchains, existing platforms that are out there in the wild today, and you are still forced to reintroduce off-chain interactions when you want to move between them. So this would be the Bitcoin Ethereum example, and we really think that federating those blockchains is a use case by itself. So that's number 1. Number 2 is parallelization. So you know, when microprocessors were already an established industry, but still pretty young. I don't know if young is, we're talking different scales between blockchains and CPUs, but think of the state of the, you know, the state of the microprocessor world in the 90s. There was a war going on between Intel and AMD, and they were essentially, it was a numbers game. It was about which CPU could run faster measured in you know, gigahertzes, right? Who was the first to the 1 gigahertz barrier, who was the first to the 2, and so on and so forth. They realized very quickly that there is only so much that you could improve on performance by going by this, you know, single-threaded architecture route. Since the mid-90s, it has been who can parallelize the best. So we have gone from single-thread netburst architectures that were literally how fast can you get this thing going to how wide can you get this thing going. So we started very, you know, modestly with dual core architectures. And obviously when you look at the world of high performance computing today, it's wide and ultra wide and ultra super wide computation platforms. So the second use case as to why bridges make sense is really to parallelize the throughput required from whatever it is you're trying to do. So the predominant portion of it doesn't land on a single network, it's actually divvied up between multiple networks. So that's the scaling use case, if you will. The third use case is maybe more to the enterprise, you know, conversation that we started with. If I go back to the original example that I gave you of, you know, there's a clearing blockchain that wants to trigger events from an insurance blockchain or a banking blockchain. A lot of people would say, well, if you build all of these use cases on top of a single platform, then you have no problem. Everything can talk to everything. But in the real world, that is not as straightforward as it might look on, you know, a blank piece of paper. There are a lot of reasons, geographic reasons, regulatory reasons, sometimes even legislation reasons why we can't just build all of the back end, all of the production systems of mature enterprises on top of a single network. There are some firewalls that are restricted for a reason. You still need to interconnect. So the Aeon model would be the essentially the hub and spoke model. You will have all these dedicated blockchains that are, you know, driving a single use case or a series of use cases that very much are thematic with each other. But then when you need to go cross-chain to do some other functionality by blockchains that you do not run, you'd be able to do them. So that that spoken model is the third use case of why Aeon is a good idea.
So, but how will that actually,
right?
From a user perspective, how will that work? Let's say, let's go back to the Bitcoin and Ethereum example. If I own a Bitcoin and I want to exchange it for an Ethereum through your network instead of going through an exchange, how will that take place? And what's the role of the Aeon token in all that?
Right. So you are still going to have to go through an exchange, but unlike what you do today, it is not a centralized solution. So maybe it's a segue for just thinking about how different people and different projects are thinking about how do you solve for that problem. So, you have, I would say, if we have two blockchains, sorry, you can't see it. We have blockchain A and blockchain B. There are a few approaches that we could take when we want to bridge between them, right? You could take a relay approach. You could create just a point of connection going from point A to point B. Maybe it goes only one way, maybe it goes both ways, but it's an ad hoc connection, right? If you're doing that, the biggest hurdle that you're going to face is when I introduce blockchain C to connect blockchain C into A and B, I now need to create relays coming from both those networks. Any new blockchain that you want to add, and you really are, dedicated to this ecosystem idea, you really want everything to talk to everything, you have to introduce a new bridge. That doesn't really scale as well, considering what we're already seeing in the market. We're seeing a multitude of different blockchains, right? We're seeing very different architectures that are good for very different types of use cases. So we already know that it doesn't scale well when you need to create a bridge peer participating blockchain in this ecosystem. So now you have a different idea. Now you're saying, well, maybe the best way to do it, the best way to connect blockchain A to blockchain B is not by creating a point-to-point connection. Maybe the best way will be to modify them in whatever way so they have a common architecture between them, right? And everything that gets built on this common architecture. So I could add all these little chains in between, and everything has the same foundation. The problem with this approach is it usually requires some pretty profound changes to existing platforms. And if we know how development of blockchains in the wild looks like, we understand that this is hard to do. It's very hard to do changes at a protocol level of already functioning blockchains, right? The third approach, and this is where Aeon comes into play, is the following thing. We're saying that we understand that it's a good idea to connect blockchain A with blockchain B, but we understand that it needs to be more scalable than ad hoc connections, and we understand that we cannot just assume that running networks will modify their code to be able to connect with a new network. So essentially you come up with the following idea. You come up with a network.
Now I don't see.
Sorry, I'm going to say, yeah, I drew it too high, my bad. You come up with a network that essentially is independent of both these blockchains. You publish an open source standard around how a bridge looks like, and you are saying to the market, here is the blueprint, here are the schematics of how you could design a bridge. If you think that there is a powerful enough, and usually it's measured in traffic and is a derivative in revenue, if you think there is a good enough reason to bridge between blockchain A and B, the way you would do it is by establishing a bridge between A to the independent blockchain named AM, and between B to the independent blockchain named AM. And then what you would do is decentralize and monetize on the bridges. So essentially, the crux of this design is how good of a bridge can you create. Our experience shows that if the blockchains are prominent enough, so again, in your example, Bitcoin and Ethereum, or if the use case creates a big enough pain point, so this would be a good example in the world of enterprise. Imagine a bank that wanted to, to have a bridge to the Ethereum network. These bridges will get built. The reason that you need an AM token is you need to create the incentive alignment of people operating bridges. You need to be able to pay them in a currency that is acceptable across a multi-blockchain type world. And that is why you need an AM coin for this blueprint to work.
Okay, I think I get it. So
I hope so.
But maybe can you go with a real use case example of it?
Sure. A real use case example would be something that we're working on right now. Unfortunately, I'm under an NDA, so I can't just give you the use case, but I could speak to the broad strokes. We're facilitating a consortium chain built on AON in a private configuration that does something, right? It's financial industry, and those guys are using it for whatever. For blockchains to be valuable, they cannot remain confined to a small subset of users. Blockchains are networks. A network is only valuable if it grows big. In the most extreme situation, if all those organizations trying to run a blockchains internally, that doesn't always make sense to me. A network is only good if there's another person on the other end talking to you. Otherwise, you're only talking to yourself. So this consortium network that we're operating needs to connect with other consortium networks again, it is financial institutions. So financial institutions coming from different regions, right? Imagine that I'm trying to connect Asia with the Middle East, with America, with Canada, with Europe, that sort of a thing. For regulation reasons, it's not going to be a single network that runs across all these different geographics. They still need to communicate, and they still need to move data back and forth, but they need to restrict it to the minimum level of data that they're even allowed to communicate across those different consortium chains. In this context, AM makes a lot of sense, because you can design the bridge not to invite a person to become an organic or an atomic participant of your blockchain. You could design the bridge to only move that type of data that you need to communicate across. So that solves a pretty big pain point of how do you actually scale, not from a technological perspective, rather than a usability and feasibility perspective. How do you scale across the globe when you're trying to create common fabrics that are decentralized?
So basically, it's about moving data from one blockchain to the other through the AON token.
Exactly. So not the AON token. Maybe let's spend a minute on this. AON today is in testnet. AON is in the AON network. AON token is an ERC token living on the Ethereum blockchain. When the testnet changes from testnet to mainnet, meaning when it actually goes live very soon, then we want to port, and again, this is up to the community because we are facilitating a bridge to do so. We want to port the token from the Ethereum blockchain to the Aeon blockchain. When you move with your token from Ethereum to Aeon, it's no longer a token, it's a coin. So we need to be very careful on the terminology. The bridges, the live implementation of the bridges, will probably utilize more the coin rather than the token. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool.
All right. So what are some major hurdles to convince organizations to use the network?
Where do I start? So here's the good news. I'll start with the good news.
Okay.
We are no longer at the phase where I would walk into, again, let's pick on the banks. They're easy to pick on. When I would walk into a bank and I would explain blockchain to them, and there would be like, so we're going to need to adopt Bitcoin, and you know, is this technology for criminals? And you know, thank God the market is no longer where we really needed to kind of talk about the legitimacy of this technology as a technology.
Well, speaking of that, someone just deleted a comment of mine about blockchain solution that I was suggesting to a cleaning ocean initiative. So that,
why?
I don't know. I just thought that it's a good idea to tokenize impact through blockchain. So I told them that they could just read more about it, and they deleted it. So it's interesting that we are still there at some point.
So, I agree with what I think is the reason for these things is the market is still not educated. Like there is so much hype going on around, cryptos generically, ICOs specifically, regulations, applications. Like there is still so much noise out there in the market that it's really first and foremost an educational challenge that we face. It is, we moved very quickly on the technology front. We're able to do way better throughputs than what we were able to do, 5 and 4 years ago, orders of magnitude. But people's perceptions, they move much, much, much slower than the technology progresses. So to your original question, Vicky, I still think it's really about educating people about the paradigm shift. It's really confusing for these people that they have, they have a valid notion. It's not like I'm dismissing where they're coming from, but for them, data is a gold mine that is proprietary to them, and they need to monetize it at all costs, protect it and monetize it. When you tell them that the new paradigm is them owning but also not owning their own data, that really confuses them. So the biggest challenge is still walking people through this paradigm shift. How does it work? Why is it a good idea? And how does it create value? Those are the 3 big questions that you need to do with any organization. And after that you go through, after you get buy-in and people get it, the next steps are probably around the implementation and then integration respectively. So implementation is around building the actual chain that achieves the use case. The integration is around how do you tie it back to legacy. It's a big challenge to be able to take something as new as a blockchain and make it play nice and make it be meaningful not in a vacuum, right? So it doesn't just live by itself. It actually needs to play nice and coexist with a lot of big building blocks that are already in the production environment for those organizations.
So what should we expect to see from Aeon till the end of the year, and maybe a few years from now? What's ahead of you?
So I'm very bullish, obviously. It's a biased opinion, but it's a genuine one. Big things, very big things. I think that you're going to see 2 main streams of operations coming from the Aeon team. You're going to see much more on the public side. So obviously our mainnet is going live very soon. Bridge designs. There's more exciting projects that are now in research that we want to roll out into, you know, POC and eventually production as soon as we can. So you're going to see a lot more activity on the public side of AON. On the, you know, on the old school, on the enterprise side of AON, you could expect to see more major stakeholders that, and that, you know, there unfortunately we can only move as fast as a really cumbersome organization allows us to move. But you could expect to see more progress, more activity, and more announcement coming from what we do with these very large partners. Every time you see that organization X, call it a bank, call it an insurance company, call it a healthcare company, every time you see them picking AON as the engine to run their you know, their decentralized architecture, then you know that even if it is a permissioned blockchain, even if it is completely cut off from the you know, from the open world, it still shares the same DNA as the open network. Meaning, it is a very easy meaning streamlined activity to decide that you actually want to create a bridge, and it's up to the discretion of those organizations, but we are trying to facilitate ease, maybe a ease of use point where it's really at discretion decision that they can make to finally open it to the outside world via bridge. So you're going to see more on the public side. You're going to see more on the private side. It's an extremely busy year for us.
Yeah, well, as we are coming to a close, would you share your thoughts on the overall blockchain development for this year and maybe for the years to come?
Sure. I think two things. I think that this year started on the wrong foot. There was a lot of criticism, a lot of uncertainty coming from the regulatory side of things. We need to endure it. As an industry, we have to go through these growing pains. I understand why, you know, why regulators are so gung-ho about trying to essentially cool off what they don't really understand, or maybe, and this is something I think they understand very well, or maybe something they believe is being abused. If we see too much hype, if we see too much, you know, noise to signal ratio, it's very hard for people, just, you know, folks to understand what's real and what's not. So I understand why it is the case that somebody, more than somebody, groups are kind of hitting the brakes. What those groups need to be careful not to do is not to bring the industry to a screeching halt, because this industry does represent the future. I believe that sincerely. When I look, maybe last comment just on this thread, when I look at the aggregate of our market, right? So think coin market cap, everyone and anyone. Don't pick winners. Don't say company A or blockchain A over blockchain B. Think everyone and anyone in our industry. And I look at our total value is approximated by again, just market caps, and that's a problematic proxy, but let's go with it for now. Does it make sense that the total industry value is, I don't know, 350 billion today? That is less than the market cap for a single commercial entity. In successful companies, you know, Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon, but does it make sense that literally the future of how the internet is going to work is worth less out of one commercial company as successful as it might be? No, that makes zero sense. So I think that we need to, it's a growing pain. It's something that we need to overcome, and we will overcome. we're pretty, resilient people in this industry. So that's comment number one. Comment number two, I think that there is a lot of maturity from some of the players in this industry broadly. We announced, so Aeon, we announced a partnership with a project called WenChain and Icon last year. And here is why I think this is a big deal. This industry or this domain, even bigger than an industry, started by everybody trying to be the end-all solution. When we started 5 years ago, we used to literally talk about the blockchain, right? Like a singular blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain. And that changed, but still too many projects contemplate that they're going to be the single end-all solution for everything and anything in the world. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And when I say that I'm encouraged by the maturity level in our industry, it's because that we understand today, we, our partners, our colleagues, our peers, we understand that that is not going to be the situation. So us having a partnership with these phenomenal projects, and I'm a big fan on the personal level, shows you that we understand that there is so much white space out there. There is so much room for everyone to grow that the focus really needs to be how do we rise together, not the zero-sum game of how do we beat each other. So there is considerable more maturity, there is considerable more uncertainty, but all in all, we're headed in the right way.
Yeah, thank you very much for those last words, because I really also think that it's important for the early players in the game to play together.
Absolutely, agreed.